Hello, everybody. Welcome to part two of the Shadowlands tier list of bosses so far. If you missed part one, I was originally recorded Castle Nathria and Sanctum all together. This is just, it was too long, so I split it in half. This is the Sanctum of Domination part. Here's the tier list that we had so far. You'll see it bigger soon, don't worry. And yeah, if you want to go watch that one, see how I came to the conclusion for all these, we will continue adding Sanctum bosses to this tier list shortly. Okay. Let's move on to Sanctum of Domination. So the first boss in Sanctum of Domination was the Terragru. I liked the Terragru a lot. The Terragru, it kind of is annoying on farm because you have to kill all the trash, get all your anima powers, summon somebody, wait for them to pick up their 4 anima powers. You're just like, man, this fight always takes 15 minutes of prep to be able to pull it every time. But the progression experience on this fight, even though it was a one-shot for almost every serious mythic progression guild, I think was actually pretty fun. The powers were interesting. There were some mechanics that would punish you if you didn't have the right powers. And I don't think first bosses are supposed to be ones that you need to wipe to a lot to be good. I think just an interesting mechanic that if they put this anima power mechanic before like the 8th boss of the tier, I think we'd have a problem. But putting it before the first boss of the tier, that's a great place for it to go. It was cool. It was a little bit off the wall, and it didn't need to be balanced in a way that was hard for bleeding edge players, because that's not what the first boss is for. And I think it's a pretty reasonable boss for pugs to go in and be able to kill. It is an interesting thing to think about, so I'm going to put it in the A tier for those reasons. An interesting thing to think about is, you can think about some tiers where the first boss is actually harder or equally hard as the next two. So examples of this would be like Abyssal Commander Savara in Eternal Palace. If you could kill that boss, you could very likely kill Blackwater Behemoth. You could very likely kill Fury of Ajara. Whereas this tier, a lot of guilds that could kill Terragru, a lot of groups that could kill Terragru pretty easily would struggle with Eye of the Jailer. So getting your 3 box out of this tier, or really out of Castle Nathria, it's not guaranteed by being able to kill the first boss. The worst example of this was like Bod, where the first boss, Champions of the Light, was just a cakewalk, right? And then Grong was actually probably twice as hard as Champions of the Light. I don't have a strong opinion about this. This doesn't really affect my rankings for bosses, but it's an interesting thing to think about, is that some tiers, that first boss is more of a gatekeeper, and by making the first boss hard, you make getting a 3 box, for instance, out of the raid easier. On the other hand, a first boss being more accessible means more guilds get to get their foot in the door. Terragru Mythic is dramatically easier than Sylvanas Heroic, although I would say probably Eye of the Jailer and 9 Mythic are also equally or easier than Sylvanas Heroic, so there's still a good bit of overlap between the hardest part of Heroic and the easiest part of Mythic, in my opinion. Okay, Eye of the Jailer is up next. Eye of the Jailer I also thought did pretty well. The version of this that we PTR tested had 4 intermissions, every 20% of the boss's health, and I think they did a really good thing when it actually came out by reducing that down to 2 intermissions, and the fight ends up being paced pretty well. It does, you split your raid and you got to kill the 2 eyes around the same time, but it's not the kind of timing that's oh, you were off by 2 seconds, you're going to wipe. It gives you a 10-second grace period before any bad things happen, and I think it ends up doing pretty well there. I think that the difficulty of this fight is largely numbersy. It just feels if you don't have enough damage, then the healing retirement is really high, and if you don't have enough healing for that, which you probably don't because you don't have enough damage, it can start to feel really rough. But I don't mind having a DPS or HPS check relatively early in the raid, and largely that is what Eye of the Jailer does, is it provides a DPS or HPS check. You can make the fight easier by saving cooldowns for those intermissions, although you have to be a little bit careful because you do need damage for the final burn as well. If you blow everything on the second intermission, you won't have damage for that. I'm going to put Eye of the Jailer... I really don't have any reason to take points off this fight. I'm going to put it up in A. It's doing a fine job of what it's supposed to. I'm putting it up there. Up next is the 9. The 9 is a fight that I feel really drags on in the final part of the fight. It's interesting in theory because it's there's 9 different Valkyr that, you fight 3 of them and the other 6 have these mechanics that they cast on the raid, and then the boss will cast Recall and it'll replay the 3 most recently ones cast all at the same time, which is kind of interesting. In practice, though, it's just you pull these 2 bosses, burn them down, There's a little bit of a difficult part while they're maybe all three are alive when the third one joins the party, and you're just fighting this last one by itself. And it feels quite easy and also quite monotonous for the last like 4 minutes of the fight while you're just taking that large health pool from 100 to 0 and doing these mechanics that, in theory, it's kind of interesting when three of them overlap, but in practice, it's not really dangerous enough to be all that scary. So I'm going to put the 9 in, I'm going to put it in C. I don't think it can really go much higher than that. Like, it didn't really commit any grievous errors, but I don't think there was really much engaging. It's really one of the most just like, I don't know, it's fun because it's fun to parse, right? It's fun to do big damage on the fight, and you're just hitting a target dummy largely, and then getting frustrated if you get a mechanic. But otherwise, that's really all it boils down to for me at this point. And it was pretty similar, pretty quick on progression as well. I think my guild one shot this boss after taking like 10 tries on Eye. Maybe it was 2 on 9, something like that. And I think that's a fairly common pattern for a lot of guilds, is reaching this fight and having it be a lot easier than Eye of the Jailer was. All right, so after this, my guild went Soul Render next, although I think Remnant next would have been a good choice as well. A lot of guilds do both of those in either order. Soul Render is one of those fights, I actually quite like the pacing on Mythic. So on Mythic, it's like ad waves are pretty frequent. You're getting ads basically all the time. And then as the fight goes on, you start getting these points where it's like ads, chains, torment, ads, chains, in like a 30-second block where you have to deal with all those mechanics back to back to back to back. And I think that's actually pretty cool. I like the way that this fight is designed as well, where it sort of ramps up in intensity, and then there's that enrage at the end, which all 4 lines come and get you if you haven't already killed the boss. There's some micromanagement to do of damage on the ads, some gripping. It's one of those fights where Death Knight's really good, and guilds without a Death Knight have a pretty nasty experience compared to guilds with a Death Knight. But I don't really want to hold that against it. I think a lot of tiers have random fights where it's like, oh, Death Knight's really good on this fight. And ad management fights are just naturally going to be kind of like that. So yeah, I thought this fight was pretty good. It was a one-phase fight the whole way through as well, which is interesting. You think about these fights that have phase 1, intermission, phase 2, phase 3. Pain Soul Render is just one phase all the way through. There's no value in stopping damage or starting damage anywhere. You're just trying to get the boss from 100 to 0. All the damage on the boss at any time is equally efficient. And I quite like the fights like that. It makes them work out really nicely on farm as well, because on farm you start lopping off the end of the fight where the hardest overlaps come, and you don't have to stop damage, do anything weird like that. You're just pushing the whole way through. So yeah, I'm going to put this one up in A as well. I think this did a great job, did a fine job, and I don't really have any complaints about it. Remnant of Ner'zhul. So Remnant of Ner'zhul was a fight that it was kind of fun to coordinate, but it was also kind of finicky and a dumb, so I talked about how I didn't discredit Soul Render for requiring Death Knights, but the effect of Mass Dispel on Remnant was pretty bad for the fight experience, because it was a lot easier if you were doing Mass Dispels. It required a little bit more coordination. It required you to have priests, but then you only got knocked once instead of twice. You didn't have to knock and then reform and get knocked again. So my guild did that, and it introduces these kind of weird fiddly problems where it's a little bit buggy. Maybe 10% of the time you just don't get knocked at all, and you're in a pool of gunk, and you die to that pretty quickly if you don't instantly health stone if you realize you didn't get knocked. Sometimes you just get knocked in a different direction than you were expecting, and it was you kind of had to understand exactly the way you were supposed to get knocked, and even still it would sometimes just knock you the other way, if you were one of the 2 people affected by the malevolence, that is. The other mechanics on this fight, I feel like all were pretty good, but that one, yeah, I don't know exactly how I would change it, but I don't think it really worked all that well, the way the Malevolence Dispels ended up feeling. Maybe just making them not dispellable and having them expire after a certain amount of time, and you just had to get in position. Or maybe instead of being dispellable, it's the person who gets it has an extra action button to dispel themselves. I'm not sure. But the way, or maybe just make it so you can't be Mass Dispelled. I don't know. The Mass Dispel meta on that fight, though, does, I think, do some weird stuff for it. So I'm going to dock a couple points for that. I'm not going to dock too many points, though. I think it was a fine fight. Other than that, had pretty cool mechanics. It ramped up over the course of the fight, but it was still like interesting near the start. You could still have the mechanics keep you awake at the start of the fight, unlike some other fights where the fights where phase 3 is phase 1 plus phase 2 plus phase 3, like this one. Sometimes phase 1 is really boring, and I didn't feel like this offended in that way too badly, so I'm gonna put it in B. Painsmith Raznal up next. This fight was phenomenal on progression, especially guilds that progressed this boss really early. You had this mechanic in the intermission where there was a spike wall with no gap in it, and you had to find a way over it. Now, for some that was easier than others, right? For some people you would soul shape, for some people you would, warlock circle, you'd blink, and for other people it was like, oh, all right, I'm going to be a goblin and I'm going to try to jump off the edge and goblin jump back on, and that ends up having a way lower success rate. It'd be a really tough thing. Some people just never able to actually figure that out. Other people not having as much of a hard time, but it was kind of a case of like how hard that mechanic was for you was kind of a big coin flip. Whether or not your guild even was comprised of 20 people that could execute that mechanic was a pretty big coin flip as well. But they nerfed that mechanic a month in to the point where there was always a gap in that wall, and that stopped being an issue. I like it when they design fights that aren't going to be possible for everybody to kill them, and then they nerf them later so that they are possible for everybody to kill them, because, those are fun to progress on, and then they nerf them to the point where everybody else can kill them after a certain point. I think that's a really good way of doing it, rather than either other extreme, the extreme of like, well, just never nerf it and just have that fight be a brick wall for those guilds, have that fight force people to race change, have that fight just punish Alliance Shaman who can't, like force them to swap Fae or whatever so that they can soul shape it, instead of, being Horde where you could switch to a Goblin jump. Alliance could Void Elf it, but Shaman couldn't be Void Elves, so it doesn't work. Anyways, what I'm saying is I don't mind mechanics being like that on progression. I think it's good that they nerfed them eventually, but on progression that was really fun, and just the whole rest of the fight on progression was great too. You had a lot of intricate management of your positioning in the room, careful footwork, particularly in the last phase. It was like a heavy damage check, and you needed everybody to react really well, whether they had the spikes or not, to where the balls spawned from and adjust their position accordingly, moving to the right spots of the room without being inefficient about it and losing damage because you had a really high amount of health to chew through in order to kill that boss. And it was just incredibly satisfying to kill this boss. So I'm going to put this one up on S tier as well. I think this was one of the greats. Also, after Painsmith, things get a little bit rough for Sanctum of Domination, though. So after Painsmith, a boss that took a lot of guilds 100 wipes, might get a little bit less, but 100, 150 wipes to kill. You'd roll up on Guardian, and Guardian was a boss that was unironically one-shot by a large portion of guilds that fought it. Compared to the heroic version of this fight, the mythic version has a couple of small changes. One, the people who get targeted by the circles need to go and charge the pylons with them, so you need to make sure that all three of the circles form a loose triangle around each of the pylons every time that mechanic goes out and charges it up. Two, the tank mechanic needs to be soaked or else the boss will lose energy. That's the obliteration. You need 4 people in each obliteration soak, but you could very easily do that by just walking in there with 3 immunities, and then, one tank would get hit along with the 3 immunes, the other tank would taunt and get hit along with the 3 immunes, and so, provided you had enough immunities to do that, that was all you had to do. All you had to do was just go in there and play, you'd play some Holy Paladins, you could play, the DPS check was light enough, you could play 6 healers. If they were Holy Paladins, they were doing a lot of damn. Anyways, their Ashen Hallow was extremely effective at both damage and healing on that fight. Everybody was always stacked up inside of it. And so you ended up killing this boss without needing to really optimize your damage, without needing to do any kind of crazy, okay, we've got to find a way to get 5 extra seconds of damage. We've got to find a way to squeeze out an extra purging protocol somewhere. Like, you didn't need to worry about any of that. You literally there were a couple mechanics that would wipe you if you screwed them up. And if you executed them properly, there was a dead boss. And so I'm going to put that one down in D. I think this fight really failed to accomplish anything with what it was doing. Ends up just being kind of a pushover, and kind of the opposite of Sludge Fist, where it has a bunch of mechanics that look important, and it turns out that they're actually not important, and there's really not too much in danger there. Like, yeah, okay, people can get sniped by the projectiles that keep hitting them, and somebody gets targeted by those 3 in a row. That could be a little bit of a pain, but It was nothing compared to the intensity of the Sludge Fist encounter. All right, after that, you would go do Fate Scribe Rocalo. Fate Scribe had a very interesting mythic mechanic. It had one mythic mechanic where it was just like during the phases, the boss would just have you go to a rune, and you would just see a big circle above one of the runes, and everybody needed to go and stand in theirs, or else you'd wipe the raid. Not a particularly satisfying mechanic. I don't think an awful one either. But then the other mythic mechanic was during the intermissions, a beam connects the rune to the middle of the room, and cuts anybody that walks over it. So in theory, if you've got like 3 runes moving left, 3 runes moving right, you're every time they're crossing over, the person on the innermost rune is going to be in danger. So maybe the outermost rune person needs to notice that and get off their rune, let the other person get through, and then reconnect the beam. Or maybe they need to do some kind of weird reaction thing, knowing that somebody can't afford to get off their rune because it's far enough away. In practice, there were a couple of problems with this. First off, you could just jump over the beams, but nobody discovered that for a while. But that was an interesting way to trivialize that part. Second off, though, you didn't ever need to move the runes in the opposite directions during the intermissions. You could just move all of them with one person on them, and they would always have enough time to reach their destination as long as you got there right at the start of the intermission. And so that trivialized that. You would just have a weak aura that assigned each person to a row, and they would get there quickly and move their runes. The laser beam idea was cool in theory. In practice, you ended up getting cut by your own beam because it originated before your rune ended. So if you just stood a little bit too much towards the inner edge of your own rune, you would get clipped by your own laser and just die out and far away from all your healers. And that felt kind of, the runes were pretty unresponsive, and it was a mechanic that I think needed to feel responsive to be good. Getting 2 people onto the rune was tough to make that happen quickly and get the rune moving correctly, and not have one of them be a couple feet off and so only one person was on the rune, so oh no, it's losing its momentum in the correct direction and starting to go in the opposite direction. The final phase, you didn't have enough time. You didn't have as much time to move the runes, so in theory you did need to send 2 people to some of them, but there were only 4 runes to move instead of all 7 or all 6. And you could also you could actually burn the boss down probably pretty close to the first couple weeks of progression. Certainly by mid farm for guilds, you didn't have to worry about the mechanic. You could just do damage to the boss and ignore it and kill the boss before it exploded. So all in all, a cool set of ideas that suffered from not thinking about if there was a way to trivialize them, which there was. So I'm gonna put Fate Scribe in D as well. It's a little bit mean because like the mechanics are kind of cool, but in practice, I think this fight again just really sort of failed to anticipate how it would be attacked and design a way to make the dumb strategies not be the best strategies. All right, Kel'thuzad is up next. Now, some people are going to expect me to put Kel'thuzad down with Stone Legion Generals, but Kel'thuzad was a fight that was like, it was dumb, frustrating, and you killed it in 20 pulls, which is much better than being dumb, frustrating, and killing it in 200 pulls, which is the case of Stone Legion Generals, right? If something is bad, the fewer pulls you kill it in, the better. As long as it's dying in 20 to 50 pulls, it's hard for it to ever be an F, because it's hard for you to be logging in for a week having the opposite of fun. So I'm not going to put Kel'thuzad in F, but I'm not going to put it above F either, or much above it either. I'm going to put Kel'thuzad in D as well. This was a fight that the progression version suffered from not understanding how we were going to wait for all our cooldowns to recover, wait until into a nice easy spot in the cast sequence, and then push the boss then, and then set up ourselves for nice easy pushes in the later phases. This was a fight where when we killed the boss, we were just like kind of meandering along. We had 5 sort of middling pulls in a row, where of the like 7 total phases of Lich Phylactery, Lich Phylactery, Lich Phylactery, Lich, right? We were kind of reaching the 4th or 5th of those and wiping, and the boss just kind of falls over. The first, almost all guilds, the first time they reach that final Lich phase, it's just going to die instantly because the boss has no health. And so it's supposed to be this cool phase where the blizzard is encroaching on you, but there's just not enough health on the boss for it to be at all close. And even if you don't have very many cooldowns, the boss is just dead before you run out of room in the room by a lot. And yeah, just the whole thing, even ignoring the world first people talk about this as being a fight that was cheese on World First because Limit and Echo ended up killing it by having their a tank cheat death trinket from Fate Scribe that let you die and then resurrect yourself to basically delete the tank ads. But even the week after they fixed that, the second week, Limit one-shot the new version of this boss, which I think just goes to show how scuffed the idea was behind this fight. I think in theory, the phases kind of could have been interesting if there wasn't just the ability to wait between all of them. Eventually, they have changed the fight such that that no longer exists, and you now have a big incentive to push the phases, but they're all a lot less deadly. But it's still bad on farm because if you gain 5% damage relative to last week in either the upstairs or downstairs portions of the phylactery phase, it throws the thing off, and it's very unforgiving if you kill the phylactery 4 seconds early. It's less unforgiving if you kill the upstairs realm 4 seconds early, but if you kill the phylactery realm 4 seconds early, you're just basically going to die, because there's going to be a couple channels from a banshee that go off, or the abomination's going to connect with your tank while enraged, and you're going to wipe. So it's still fiddly and dumb on farm, and it's one of those fights where if your DPS profile changes a little bit from week to week, you kind of have to be like, okay, do we have to rethink how Kel'Thuzad is going to work? Does this mean we're going to push early by accident and like push during some tank ads being alive? Does this mean that we're going to push phylactery too fast? Does this mean we're going to kill upstairs too fast and the Reavers are going to respawn? So a bunch of dumb stuff there. But no sin can be as great as the Stone Legion General's sin. This is dramatically less bad than that. Still quite bad. So our D tier here is now comprised entirely of those fights between Painsmith and Sylvanas in Sanctum. It was a really, really rough the 3 bosses after Painsmith. All 3 of them ended up being just dramatic letdowns from what we were hoping they could have been. So it's a shame. Sylvanas itself was a fight that so initially people were like, this fight is going to be great before they PTR tested it. After PTR testing, there was kind of this outcry of like, oh no, you can't play melee on this fight, which was extremely dumb. Because first of all, PTR testing, basically everybody only tested phase 1. A couple of guilds got past phase 1. My guild got into phase 2 and then crashed to desktop like twice because it was, testing. And that was, the extent of our testing. And yeah, phase 1 is like, it's not great to be melee there, but phase 1s never matter, right? You always end up having enough damage. Every single end boss phase 1, by the time you're ready to kill the boss, you're stopping damage in phase 1. That's just almost always true of the way they design end bosses. And Sylvanas was no exception. It didn't end up being a fight that was hostile to melee in any real meaningful way. You could bring 10 melee and be totally fine on this fight. Ends up being a fight, though, that people, after doing Heroic Week, were like, oh, this is real bad. On Heroic Week, very few guilds killed Sylvanas. It was really tough on Heroic Week. And I think unexpectedly so. I think Blizzard didn't expect it to be killed by as few guilds as actually killed it on Heroic Week. My guild barely killed it right at the end of Heroic Week. And we'd originally had designs to kill it twice, to kill it in 2 different raids. Ended up only being able to kill it in 1 raid that was, we didn't even have all of our roster in because we were trying to optimize for a raid size that made it easy, which, by the way, if you're anybody who's ever advocating for flex size mythic raids, that sort of experience would be very common, where it's like, you'd have 30 people on the roster and you would play 13 for a fight where that number made the mechanics good, and you pay 17 for the next fight, and then you play 27 for the next fight, and that would be dumb. So, little side note there if you're on that team. Anyways, the heroic version of the fight was pretty bad. Heroic phase 1, you just have these arrows kind of falling randomly over the room, big old pain. Intermission, they're just scattered all over the place. People are dying to random ones that are really far away. Mythic made phase 1 a lot better. Mythic, the arrows drop all in clumps, and they're difficult to deal with. If anybody touches their arrow, it wipes the raid, but ends up being pretty manageable if you use your cooldowns for them. Really great change to the way that mechanic worked on Mythic. Ends up, I think, being actually a pretty good phase 1 compared to the Heroic one. Phase 2, so much better on Mythic than Heroic. On Heroic in phase 2, you appear on the first bit of the chain, you take Thrall's little Earth Bridge, you go on across a next sequence of chain while you're not fighting any mobs, you're literally just dodging haunting waves, then you go and you hit Sylvanas for a bit, and then you go between 3 platforms of ads, and then you hit Sylvanas for a bit, and then you're in the last phase. And that phase takes like 6 minutes on Heroic. On Mythic, the intermission phase is much more faster paced. You have to split your raid into 2 and send them down opposite bridges at the start. kill different sets of ads, reconvene to hit Sylvanas for a bit, split your raid again to go to the next 2 ad platforms, and then reconvene and hit Sylvanas again before going into the last phase. Much more action-packed, much more interesting. You do have to like balance your damage between the 2 sides. In a sense, that's kind of annoying for farm, as whenever you have those sorts of finicky damage precision things. But also on farm, it doesn't matter as much if one bridge is fast because you don't need all the damage on Sylvanas anyways, so that's fine. And then the last phase, phase 3 of Sylvanas, one of the best Mythic last phases they've done for a boss in ages. It's like 6 minutes long on Mythic. The mechanics are brutal and fast-paced. You have very short reaction times, you know, reacting to like, oh, there's a swirly that needs to get soaked. Oh, there's a veil on me or somebody near me. Like, you have 0.5 seconds to move into or move out of those things. And they're a bunch of mechanics that are just going to wipe you if you get them wrong. But it's not like they don't really feel unfair. They just feel really hard, like Dark Souls hard, you know, quick reactions needed. And then there's you know, some strategy that needs to be done, moving to other platforms, vacuuming up the gunk, dropping it on the platform that you're about to leave, heavy tank damage, heavy damage on the whole raid, heavy DPS requirement, especially on progression. Very satisfying boss to kill, though, when you eventually get to that last platform. You finally have enough damage. You hit that bloodlust. The boss is at like 52%, and you're just like, yeah, we're finally doing it, right? We finally have gotten through all of these really tough mechanical overlaps. So I'm actually going to put Sylvanas up in A. I think that the phases 1 and 2, even though they're better on Mythic, they are still a weakness on the fight. But phase 3 is phenomenal. It was a good fight. And I don't think it was as good as Sire, but I do think it was pretty good. And that is where I'm going to land on it. Is I have a lot of nice things to say about it on Mythic, and I was worried. I was worried after Heroic Sylvanas that it was going to be like a awful end boss, but it was not. It was pretty good. So, yeah, this is my list. This is my list of Shadowlands bosses so far. This video has gone on for much longer than I expected because it turns out I had a lot of rambling to do here. Maybe I should have broken this up into Sanctum and Castle Nathria instead of doing them all in one video, but you know, it's nice when you can get a whole year's worth of expansion bosses done in one video. Maybe not a good sign for how much content we've been getting, but you know, there it is. There's my thoughts on the bosses. Of course, there's one more tier that is hidden down there. That's Stone Legion Generals. Keep that nice and out of sight, though. You guys don't have to keep looking at that. Let me know if you disagree, how you disagree with this list of rankings. Of course, remember all the caveats I said at the start about how I was ranking based on where they were in the tier, all those sorts of things. But I think this is a pretty accurate representation of how I felt about these fights. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and stuff. See you in the next one.